Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 30, Gruul Ramp. The archetype's theme on Arena is battles, and although there are some battles that made the list for my top cards, it's far from calling it the theme of the archetype, and I've found the theme to be more about ramping to big beefy things, similar to how Simic plays out in a lot of other sets. The other thing, too, that I've found is that there are many parts that can work in replacement for another card, which means that there are many cards to cover, so let's get started. My Tier 1 common is Volcanic Spite. One of Gruul's biggest weaknesses is early game. There are not a lot of 2-drops, and I usually spend my first couple of turns trying to ramp. Cheap removal then becomes very important if my opponent is applying a lot of early pressure. Another thing that is common with ramp strategies is dumping your hand and relying on top decking much sooner than your opponent. Volcanic Spite lets you ditch extra lands in favor of finding another big bomb. To no one's surprise, this card gets picked up early, so grab them when you can. Now this might come as a surprise, but I've been very impressed with Arachnoid Adaptation. I put it at Tier 2. Ideally you want at least 5 pieces of interaction, and most of the time, as long as you play around your opponent's removal, this is a 1-cost removal spell. They also are greatly underappreciated for how they play out, commonly available late into the wheel around pick 11. In the same category as Arachnoid Adaptation, but maybe a more traditional route, is Cosmic Hunger. I put it at Tier 2 as well. The first 3 commons all share the same thing in common: cheap removal. This allows you to ideally ramp while also removing your opponent's pieces so as not to fall too far behind, so that your late game threats can stabilize and win the game. Because of its potential for getting 2-for-1 by your opponent's removal, people aren't too high on it, and it usually is something that you can pick up around pick 5 or 6. The next thing on my checklist is lands. And you want to get to your top-end threats in cards like Overgrown Pest, as long as you don't remove a land down to 16, help you get to your top end. Also, one of the rares that comes to mind in Gruul is Etali, which is a double-faced card that this can help you dig for. They tend to get picked up around average common these days, around 5 or 6. They were going like hotcakes at the beginning of the set because many thought it was going to be a lesser version of Contagious Vorak from Phyrexia All Will Be One, but the 2/2 stat block brought it down to an appropriate power level for common. Next up on the checklist is 2-drops. Although the focus of most of my Gruul decks has been the top end, you need 2-drops to make it to the top end. I think the bare minimum is 4, but that might be because I value 1 and 2-drop removal highly in this archetype. The main takeaway being that you want 6 to 8 cards that affect the early game, even when your focus is 5-cost bombs. Wary Thespian is my go-to 2-drop in green, and is usually available around pick 7 or 8. Seed of Hope also deserves a mention. I found this to be useful in decks that have a low spell count, so 4 or 5 instances and sorceries, which Gruul can end up having since your battles and enchantments are permanents. I also tend to have some sort of bomb, like Etali, that I'm eager to find, and this card helps me do just that. It is often one of the last cards in the pack, so you won't need to go out of your way to include 1 copy. Now for Tier 3. This card falls under the Find the Bomb category in the checklist. As I mentioned in my guide to Boros, this combos very well with Marauding Dreadship. Hanger Scrounger and Marauding Dreadship are both available at common, and both tend to wheel. It's a combo I will mention in every guide involving red, just because I think more people should be using it, especially if you want to find a bomb in your deck. Next up at Tier 3 we have Beamtown Beatstick. The options for ramp are pretty limited in this set, but this is one way to do it. Beatstick creates a treasure token if you can hit your opponent. You only need this to connect a couple of times to be able to slam an expensive bomb that will have your opponent asking themselves, maybe I should have held on to my removal. Now for a nod to the archetype's theme, Onaki Javelineer I put at Tier 3, and I'll put an asterisk on it. You only want to pick these up if you have battles that you care about flipping, and there are a couple in this archetype that we're about to get into. These also wheel, so don't go out of your way to pick them up, but if you happen to have one, I do think they are a little overlooked and undervalued in this archetype. Converter Beast, I put at tier 3, and solely because it combines nicely with Tangled Skyline at Uncommon. If you don't have Tangled Skyline, I'd bump this down to filler. They tend to wheel, so it shouldn't be hard to pick it up if green is open. The second piece of ramp available at Common is Blighted Burgeoning. This is a necessary card if you are going for the 4 or 5 colored green soup strategy, so it tends to get picked up around pick 6 or 7. But it combos very nicely with Portent Tracker, the third and final piece of ramp that I recommend at Common. Turn 2 Portent Tracker, turn 3 Blighted Burgeoning means at the very least you get to flip your Incubator token on your opponent's turn the round that you played Blighted. Then on turn 4, you have 6 mana if you play a land. This is how Dreams of turn 4 Kogla happen. I highly recommend it. Portent Tracker can also chip at flipping a battle, or prevent your opponent from chipping away at a battle. I've used both, and it's a nice option to have after you have ramped out your hand. My last tier 3 common is Chomping Kavu. Nothing particularly amazing about it in Gruul, other than it prevents your opponent from blocking the big, beefy green creature you ramp to with a 1/1. They also go late and can get picked up on the wheel. Now for the uncommons. We all know Death Touch goes nicely with Trample, but you know what else works well? Double Strike. Build your own Embercleave. The Trample prevents them from just chumping with a 1/1, and you smack for a ton of damage. I'm a big fan of Fearless Scald, and I'm happy that I still find these around pick 6 or 7 when red is open, and I put it at tier 1. My other tier 1 uncommon is Emoti, Celebrant of Bounty. I have often found myself splashing blue for teamwear, big things, especially since the top performing mythic, Borgamos and Fibblethip, also requires a blue splash, so might as well be prepared. Like Simic, I tend to have a fair amount of large 6-drop threats that can trigger the Cascade, and I won't even have obnoxious counterspells to bump into either. Worth splashing in my opinion, especially since this card is undervalued and can be picked up as late as pick 6 or 7. Now for tier 2. I'd prefer to have Volcanic Spite over Stoke the Flames, but rare is the draft that I have enough Volcanic Spites to not be happy to see Stoke in the pack. Don't forget that this can hit any target, so you can use your burn spells to flip battles. As premium red removal, you'll have to pick it up early. My other tier 2 uncommon is also removal. Tandem Takedown can also target battles, which I think is sometimes overlooked. As premium green removal, it also goes early. Also, I tend to be base green since 2 out of 3 of the ramp options at common are in green, and you may have noticed that the entirety of tier 2 commons were green, so the double pip isn't too much of a problem. Now for tier 3, and this is where your piloting skills as a drafter will be tested. Invasion of Mercadia is in the Dig for Your Bombs checklist. If you picked up enough Overgrown Pests and Hanger Scrounger Dreadship combos, then this card is less necessary. And it still allows you to discard a land late in the game after you've ramped, so you won't be unhappy if you decided to include it. Since you aren't going wide and probably aren't splashing Tetsuko, you also aren't very interested in flipping this card. Lithomatic Barrage I put at tier 3, and I think is very undervalued. Typically thought of as a best of 3 sideboard card that you bring in against blue or white players, I've often found it to work well enough even outside of that matchup. It helps that blue and white is the strongest archetype, so you tend to bump into it more often, and dealing 5 damage for 1 mana is an absolute blowout in the value game. Another upside is that you can pick these up on the wheel, which is great for an uncommon, and is a happy alternative if you're struggling to find your 5 pieces of interaction. Invasion of Urgatha is for when you have a battle you really want to flip, which, along with Javelineer at common, I only aim to pick up once I have the other battle. And there's only 1 battle at uncommon that I think is worth flipping, but there are a couple at rare, so most of the time I pass on this since the uncommon battles tend to get picked up earlier than I think they should. Invasion of Urgatha, for example, is usually gone by pick 6. Kenra's Spell Spear is worth a mention since it can be a real struggle to find good 2-drops in this archetype. It pairs well with the cheap removal I aim to have, so that I can interact with the board while continuing to ramp. Nothing special, and since it gets picked up by pick 3 or 4, I often find myself procrastinating at filling out my 2-drops. Speaking of 2-drops, Streetwise Negotiator might be the best one. I should mention too that there is an aggro build available in Gruul, where Invasion of Regatha and Stoke the Flames can be used to burn out your opponent, but since most of the pieces are at uncommon, it's hard to build consistently. So most of the time, Streetwise Negotiator is less about pressuring your opponent, and more about green and red lacking good 2-drops at common. For example, another preferred 2-drop of mine is Herbology Instructor. The 1/3 stat block and 3 life is great at stalling until you get your late game threats. Both Herbology and Negotiator get picked up at an average time for an uncommon, around 4 or 5. Eventually, I start to panic that I don't have enough 2-drops, and I wish I had been a little bit more disciplined to pick them up earlier in the draft. Invasion of Zendikar is the 4th piece of ramp, and the first battle that I believe is worth flipping, especially because you can flip it with a Volcanic Spite, since it only has a measly 3 defense and flips into Awakened Skyclave, a 4/4 Vigilance Haste that also acts as a land for even more ramp. This tends to be gone by pick 3 or 4. The fact that the front side finds 2 lands and then the flipped side taps for any color means this is a top pick for those who want to paint with all the colors of the wind. If you do manage to pick one of these up, then Invasion of Regatha and Javelineers become more interesting because of how easy this battle is to flip with only 3 defense. Storm the Seed Core I also put at tier 3. Some of the bombs, looking at you Kogla and Yidaro, don't have trample. So take a moment to see how many of your finishers would benefit off of trample. I often include 1 copy of Storm the Seed Core because it can make even a 5/5 incubator token off of Converter Beast or Tangled Skyline into a 9/9 Vigilance Trampler. And they tend to go late for an uncommon around pick 7. Tangled Skyline I also put at tier 3. I tend to have better late game threats, but if your late game plays aren't going to immediately demand removal or else you win, the next best thing is helping you stabilize. And gaining 5 life and a 5/5 with reach is a very nice defensive card. Hopefully you can do better, but something has to be the worst card you hope to improve on, and you can still pick these up around, you can still pick up 1 or 2 since they tend to go around 5 or 6. Rampaging Geoderm is my last tier 3 uncommon. A 4/4 trample haste for 4 makes me wish that Gruul aggro had better support at common, since this can be so good on the beatdown. And I see where they were trying to go with Gruul as an archetype, since combining this with War Historian, the 3/3 at common that gets indestructible if it's attacking a battle, seems like it should be a fun time. The problem is that battles in general don't give you enough for flipping them, since they essentially increase your opponent's life total, and in a set where it's a race to the bombs, I'd rather be pressuring their life than trying to flip battles for value. Again, you might find yourself being able to pull off Gruul aggro, and then this is a top tier uncommon. But it's awkward if you're trying to race to a 7-drop. The upside is they go late for an uncommon around pick 7 or 8, and sometimes the stars are in alignment for the aggro deck. Speaking of 7-drops, now for the rares. There are 10 that made my list specifically for Gruul. It was fun to do this archetype immediately after Boros, which might be its exact opposite for a red archetype. In Gruul, the number 1 reason I end up in the archetype is opening up one of these rares in pack 1 and trying to maximize its value. Etali is best in Gruul because you can ramp to it with green and dig for it with Overgrown Pest and Seed of Hope. It's tier 1 in every red archetype except for Boros because of the mana cost, but in Gruul I put it at tier S. The ability to transform it in is also Phyrexian green, so it feels right at home, and flipping it into Etali, Primal Sickness, and 11/11 Trample Indestructible Toxic Creature. Of all of the archetypes, I think Gruul has the most realistic chance of being able to afford the 9 and Phyrexian green, but it's usually just for your inner Timmy, since the front side is usually more than enough to win the game. Voldaren Thrillseeker is another rare that inspires me to see if Gruul is open. I put it at tier 1. Being able to give a big beefy green creature +2/+2 and then fling it, sometimes after combat, to deal damage directly to their face can win the game on the spot. And the last rare that makes me go, yep, it's time for Gruul, is Kogla and Yidaro. The restrictive mana cost makes it a very bold splash outside of the Gruul archetype, and hitting them with a turn 4 7/7 Trample Haste can feel all so good. I highly recommend it. Also, being able to cycle to destroy an artifact or enchantment has happened, and it shouldn't be overlooked. Sometimes you just want to remove their big beefy creature and leave behind a 7/7. Any way that you play it, once this comes down, especially if you ramp to it, the game becomes very difficult for your opponent, and it's an easy tier 1 rare. Now for tier 2. These are rares that don't immediately make me think of Gruul, but I'm more than happy to pick up. Ancient Imperiosaur, for example, is equally good in Selesnya because of counter synergies, but Gruul comes to mind because Gruul has Ral's reinforcements at common, which can aim to convoke this out as quickly as possible. Since I'm covering my favorite rares for Gruul, I'm going to skip Glistening Dawn. It's a great bomb rare that goes in every green deck. I just try to put it in Golgari or Simic because of Incubator synergies. I put it at tier 2. Invasion of Ixalan is worth a mention. It's best in Selesnya, where you can use cards like Aerial Boost to flip it early, and Gruul, since you can use cards like Invasion of Regatha or Stoke the Flames to flip it early as well. The earlier you can flip this into Belligerent Regisaur, the better. Since, as I've mentioned in one of my earlier guides, this card is great until they play something with 5 toughness, which is another upside to Selesnya and Gruul. You aim to be playing some sort of backup creatures, like in Gruul, Hanger Scrounger, and Fearless Scald, which can push this up to a 5/4 indestructible, which does better in the later turns. My last tier 2 rare is Glissa, Herald of Predation. Since many of the cards that ramp also fix, it can be easy to splash, and Glissa, Herald of Predation is worth the splash. It generates so much value, your opponent must answer it with removal, or they will be drowning in First Strike Death Touch Incubator tokens. Now for tier 3. I'm going to skip Doomscar Warrior. Generally, I already plan on picking up cards that help me dig for my bombs, and would rather have a rare bomb instead of a rare that digs for bombs. I really like it in Golgari, since it can help find Glissa, and the archetype generally has less dig. Still an easy inclusion. Captain Lannery Storm, on the other hand, goes perfectly in Gruul, and I think it is its best archetype. It fits nicely into the ramp strategy, and equip it with a beat stick to really be drowning in treasure tokens. I'm going to skip Rampaging Raptor. I put it at tier 3 and prefer it in Izzet, since flipping Invasion of Mercadia tends to be pretty important in my strategy in that archetype, and the double pip in red can make it difficult in Gruul, since I tend to be mainly green. Invasion of Karsus, on the other hand, is a card designed for Gruul. Since I aim to ramp to my big threats, the board state can be very lopsided towards my opponent, and one risk you run is getting overwhelmed, especially against Azorius Knights and Izzet Convoke, which can create some massive board states very early in the game. The nice thing about having one big creature when they have 4 or 5 smaller ones is a board wipe that deals 3 isn't going to set me back, and can be a nice reset button to include. After 4 defense, it flips into Refraction Elemental. This isn't a huge priority to flip, but it's okay since you just need to cast 2 spells for it to catch up for the 4 defense, and who knows, you might already be planning on flipping some battles. I'm going to skip Nahiri's Warcrafting. I find it best in Rakdos, which is all about removal and has a higher chance of red being the main color and having small things to cast off of the dig. Polychronos Reborn, which I like in Selesnya and Simic. and Ozolith, which I like in Celestia because of counter synergies. They are all great, decent inclusions if you happen to find them. Deeproot Wayfinder deserves a special mention since it helps you dig and ramp at the same time. Both things that Gruul is interested in doing. I put it at tier 3, and I think that Gruul is its best archetype. Last but not least, I think Obosh is worth a mention. Not necessarily for being able to companion it, but because it makes Etali deal double damage, and making your big things deal double damage fits well into the archetype. I put it at tier 3. Now for the mythics. Borgamos and Fibblethip is one of the best mythics in the set, and if you are in Temur or green-blue-red combinations, you should be looking to splash this guy. I put them at tier S. I think Gruul is the best since most of the cards that ramp also fix, and it's most in line with what I want to do with the archetype. Also, after you are done ramping, it's nice to have something to do with the extra lands that you will inevitably top deck in this archetype. Oh, and it's another reason why I mentioned Obosh, since it pairs quite nicely as an odd mana cost creature as well. I put Invasion of Tarkir at tier 1. Even though Etali is a dinosaur and not a dragon, this archetype is the most likely to flip it into Defiant Thundermaw. 2-cost removal that flips into a late-game threat? Yes, please. You're happy to include it in every archetype, but especially Gruul, which I think is its best archetype, because you might actually have a plan to flip a fair number of battles. I'm going to briefly mention Chandra, Hope's Beacon. I prefer her in Rakdos and Izzet, where you are more likely to be able to dig 2 removal spells, and where she's more important as a removal spell herself. She's still an easy inclusion in Gruul. I put her at tier 1. Vorinclex I also put at tier 1, but I prefer it in Golgari, and will save covering it in more detail until next week. I'm also going to skip Ragavan, who I find best in Izzet, since pairing it with Tetsuko is just downright dirty. But it does ramp, so it's an easy inclusion in Gruul, and I put it at tier 2. Sword of Once and Future I will also save for when I cover Golgari next week, and put it at tier 2. The last mythic that I would like to shine the spotlight on is Urabrask the Hidden. Giving all of your big beefy creatures haste just means you get to close out the game 1 turn sooner. There isn't another archetype that really fits this card since it is very aggressive, but also a 5-drop. Works well enough for ramp though. Thank you for watching my guide to Gruul. Next week I will cover the last 2 archetypes, Golgari and Orzhov, and then it will be time for Lord of the Rings. I'm a huge fan and very excited for its release, available on Arena June 20th. I will also be posting my overview of the set on the same day. Remember to click like and subscribe. One day I hope to qualify for early access so that I can bring back my knowledge to our little community. Good luck getting those trophies, and I'll see you next week.